All right. So, for the last of Tooby and Cosmides' 5 principles of evolutionary psychology, it's something that we've already discussed before. The idea of the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. And they use the term, "our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind," as kind of a catchy phrase to make that intuitively appealing. Basically, it's the idea that our minds have been shaped by natural selection to deal with the adaptive problems that have existed in our ancestral past. And naturally, Tooby and Cosmides talk about the EEA in the same way that we've talked about it in previous lectures. They suggest that the EEA for one trait might be different from the EEA for another trait. For example, our visual systems, the EEA for those might be conditions of terrestrial illumination, basically light. And these have remained relatively constant for hundreds of millions of years. On the other hand, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness that's selected for mechanisms that cause human males to provision for their offspring, a situation that departs from that of a typical mammalian pattern, and indeed many other non-human primates whom we are closely related to, appears to only be about 2 million years old. Regardless, we're talking about years in terms of recent in million-year increments, as opposed to ancient in hundreds of millions of years. This underscores the idea that most of the complex adaptations that we have that rely on thousands and thousands of genes, and I'll show a video in a minute that illustrates that, probably have not changed that much in the last 100 years, when we've had a lot of new technology, 500 years, or even 250 or so with the Industrial Revolution, and even maybe 5,000 years with the advent of agriculture and living in cities. This is what we mean by a Stone Age mind, so to speak. Even so, our minds remain quite adapted to our modern environment in many ways. Who can think of some examples about how our minds are really well adapted to the modern environment? Things that we are really good at. Silly answers are often good answers here.
Using a computer?
Using our computer. That is a silly answer. And it's actually, rather than having adaptations for using computers, we've shaped cultural innovation to match well with things we already have, like fingers to type in our visual system, etc. It's actually remarkable that we've created things like cars and computers and tools that work so well with what we already have adapted for savanna lifestyles. What about some other things that might actually serve the same functions that they evolved for in our EEAs?
Eating?
Eating. What do you mean?
Eating, just
Oh, eating.
eating,
Yes. Being hungry and knowing to eat when you need sustenance. Anything else that we can think of? So think of the last time you left your hand on a surface hot enough to burn it, like your stove at home. The last time you asked a chair out on a date. Have you ever asked a chair out on a date? No, that seems really weird, right?
Oh.
Yes? One yes?
Yeah,
Was it awkward?
so awkward.
And the last time that you ate an apple covered with mold. So in a lot of ways, our psychologies are still very well attuned to behave in a functional manner. We generally ask other humans out on dates in a fairly constrained age range. We generally don't leave our hands on burners hot enough to damage our flesh severely. And some people, unfortunately, do have sensory disorders where they can't feel pain, and they end up having some pretty serious problems. And we generally don't eat foods that are obviously, for our sensory systems, covered in infectious microbes. In other ways, our psychology might seem a little strange, in that it's designed for an EEA different from what we live in now. we actively try not to have babies using birth control pills, hormonal contraception, and other technologies. We're scared of snakes and spiders that kill almost no one, and people have intense phobias of those. But we barely flinch at cars, which kill thousands and thousands of people a year. And we eat these unhealthy foods when we actually don't need the calories, and they actually lead us to dying early. So what this suggests is that selection may have favored brains that could solve specific problems, such as avoiding pathogens, avoiding having sex with close kins, detecting and punishing cheaters, favoring kin over non-kin in terms of cooperative exchange, acquiring a mate who is likely to produce children, detecting in-group versus out-group members, caring for offspring. Each of these problems requires a different manner of processing information. This is really at the core of what we mean by modularity. So let's give an example. One of my favorite examples that Tooby and Cosmines talk about in their primer on evolutionary psychology, with dung beetles, who have had a different EEA than humans, and therefore process information differently than humans do. So the dung fly EEA, for them, cow feces, cow shit, is a source of nutrition. It's a food source. And for humans, though, it's not. It's indeed something that could be pathogenic, but it actually has very little nutritional content for humans. Our digestive systems are not set up in a way that processes it as nutrients. This can probably be reflected in the neural circuits of these two organisms. Humans' neural circuits have evolved to perceive the sensory information associated with cow feces in a specific way. What do you feel when cow feces are around? Nausea? Anything else? Lecker?
Disgust?
Disgust. Nausea, disgust, revulsion. Basically all of these feelings that motivate you to what?
Not to you.
Not eat it. Don't touch it. Get away from it. Now, do you think that the dung fly feels disgust, nausea, and revulsion to that exact same thing? I've never asked a dung fly, and it can't really communicate that information, but it certainly does not behave in that way. In fact, I would be fairly certain that it responds to cow feces in the same way that we might respond to the smell of roasting meat or seasoned vegetables or something like that. In effect, its neural circuits have evolved to process the exact same chemical signatures that are released by that cow dung, the exact same visual information, but instead of outputting a revulsion response, outputting an appetitive response, an approach response. All right. That's the extent to which I'm going to discuss modularity until I come back to a few specific research examples of mine and tell you a little bit about my research. Before then, I want to take a few moments to talk about evolutionary psychology and genetics, and specifically the difference between evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. This is a book by a sociologist slash biologist that was titled, "Love of Shopping is Not a Gene." Somewhat self-righteously, I think. Problems with Darwinian Psychology. Basically implying that Darwinian psychologists think that there is an I love shopping gene that some people have, and that makes them love shopping. And other people don't have the I love shopping gene, and therefore they don't love shopping. That sounds pretty silly, right? I think it sounds pretty silly. It is silly. So what does heritability mean? This is something that we often hear about when we talk about genes and behavior, and sometimes even in evolutionary psychology. Heritability, by definition, is the proportion of variance in a population that is due to genetic differences between individuals. So let's break that down a little bit. In a population, in a group, everyone differs in some traits. There are differences in, for example, height. Heritability is the proportion of those observed differences that are caused by genes, that are caused by differences in genetics. What else could cause differences in height other than genetics? Any ideas?
External factors.
External factors, exactly. And in fact, in the lingo of behavioral genetics, it's generally referred to as environment. But yes, it's external factors. Genes or environment can contribute to variation between individuals. Heritability is the proportion of that variability that's caused by genes. So let's take a break, brief break, and name some possible adaptations, some products of natural selection. Don't even think behavioral for a second. Think about morphological traits. Who can give me an example?
Skin color.
Skin color. So we could talk about different melanin contents being adaptations for neutralizing UV radiations in different parts of the world. So in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe more melanin is good to stave off skin cancer, and in Northern Europe, less melanin is good to absorb vitamin D. Another example. Anything we talked about in an earlier slide. How about lungs, or kidneys, or brains? Organs. Organs are adaptations for performing specific functions. Now let me ask you, what is the heritability of number of kidneys?
100%.
Not close to 100%.
95?
0. Well, it's not exactly, because there are going to be probably some differences, but there's virtually no variance in number of kidneys. With some exception, everyone has 2 kidneys. So basically we're dividing by 0 there. It's an indefinite number. What evolutionary psychologists do, and I'm spoiling what's going to be on another slide, is generally focus on putative, so supposed universal aspects of our psychology, how our mind has been shaped through natural selection. They don't deal with differences between people. So I got ahead of myself a little bit there. But these traits generally have indefinite heritability. So what are the differences between evolutionary psychologists and behavioral geneticists? Evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. And to contrast these two perspectives, I've put Charles Darwin, whom we're familiar with, and who's usually pictured with long white hair and looking like this sagely old man. But when he was younger, he actually looked quite a bit like this man up top. Has anyone ever heard of Francis Galton? Yes? So Galton was Darwin's half-cousin and one of the most prolific researchers in the history of England. And both incredibly brilliant and a little bit controversial because he's the founder of eugenics, for one thing, which is basically the idea of by policy selectively encouraging or discouraging breeding for the idea of shaping society in a certain way, which has a fairly unsavory implication. But he's also arguably the founder of behavioral genetics. So he had the idea that there is heredity of genius. Basically, smart people have smart kids. His interest was really trying to explain differences between individuals, whereas Darwin's interest was really trying to focus on the reason why species had similar traits, why they evolved to be a certain way. To break this down a little, behavioral genetics is fundamentally concerned with differences between individuals. Evolutionary psychology is fundamentally concerned with human universals. So they're almost opposite perspectives. Behavioral genetics explicitly model genetic versus environmental effects on behavior. So like I just said, behavioral geneticists will look at what is the proportion of variance accounted for by genes, and what is the proportion of variance accounted for by environment in a specific trait. Evolutionary psychologists rarely, if ever, make references to the relative influence of these two. Evolutionary psychologists almost never posit there's a gene for this, or these genes are shaping this. Just like a biologist would never say what genes favor the development of the heart. There's so many genes involved that there's really not a credible research program that would involve investigating that. I have a brief 2-minute video to show you illustrating this point. I like the content. The presenter is a little bit boring.
Geneticists are trying to figure out if certain genes can explain differences in behavior, like thrill-seeking, aggression, and nurturing. For every 100,000 people who enjoy hiking in the mountains, for example, only 1 or 2 feel the need to climb to the top of Mount Everest. How can we explain this variation in behavior? How much does it have to do with family background or life experience? Or are some people just born wanting to take on extreme challenges? Research over the past few years has shown that the genetics behind complex behavior is trickier than we first thought. Differences in behavior aren't the result of 1, 2, or even a handful of genes. Consider the most famous of lab insects, the lowly fruit fly, known to scientists as Drosophila melanogaster. These fruit flies naturally fight over food, like who gets access to a tasty piece of rotten banana. Researchers now think the activity of 4,000 of the fruit fly's 15,000 genes determine how tough the insects will get with each other. So if the genetics of behavior is that complicated in a fruit fly, imagine how complicated it would be for a human. After all, the brain of a fruit fly contains around 100,000 neurons, while the brain of a human contains 100 billion neurons, or 1,000,000 times as many neurons as a fruit fly. The bottom line? Any study claiming a single gene can predict whether you're gay, prone to violence, a liberal, or a conservative is probably not going to pan out in the end. Nor are we likely to ever find a gene for extreme mountain climbing. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Christine Gorman.
What are we laughing at?
Nothing.
Nothing? I like the animation of the skull with the eyes. Okay. Any questions about that? So this is generally the theme of genetics and behavior, genetics and personality. Everything she said is absolutely consistent with what I know about the field. There is no one gene that influences behavior, and these things are incredibly complex. So if this is the case and we can't find a gene for a behavior, what do behavioral geneticists do? How do we look at genetic versus environmental effects on variation between individuals? Any ideas? Something you've heard of, or an opportunity to be really clever and invent something yourself? So generally, behavioral geneticists look at twins. They look at twin pairs, and they have huge databases of monozygotic and dizygotic twins. So identical twins and fraternal twins. Monozygotic twins have the exact same DNA. They're 100% related to each other genetically, and shoot, this says different environments, but it should say same environment. Sorry about that. They have the same DNA and the same environment, whereas dizygotic twins have different DNA. They're related just like sibling pairs who are not twins, and they have the same environment. The degree to which monozygotic twins are more similar to each other on personality traits, intelligence, risk-taking, etc., behavioral geneticists then make an inference that that trait has some genetic influence. They don't actually say which gene it is because there are thousands and even hundreds of thousands of genes that influence these behaviors, but they can at least point to the relative influence of genetic versus environmental effects. Yes?
But an environment can never be the same.
Yes, great point. So they partition environments into different components. They partition sources of variation into genetic factors based on differences between monozygotic and dizygotic twins, shared environment, which is essentially the degree to which twin pairs are raised by the same parents, and unshared environment. So everything else that's happening outside of parental influence. So all these environmental things where, just as you said, twin 1 is going to be having different friends than twin 2. They might be exposed to different type of language. They might be exposed to different places and status hierarchies within groups. They might have different nutrition, etc. So essentially, all that unshared environment is just assume that these are differences in the environment that these individuals are exposed to. Yes?
Yeah, isn't it correct that the monozygotic twins should be in a different environment? Because then you can look at the genetic and environmental impacts on behavior. Because if you would put them in the same environment, it's far harder to look at the genetic impact.
Yes. So there are different types of designs that behavioral geneticists use. So some designs are just with twin pairs that are raised together, both with mono and di. There are also adoption studies that people use. So looking at siblings that are raised apart versus together. There are twins that are raised apart to together versus together. There are a multitude of methods that behavioral geneticists use to try to tease out these types of effects.
Yeah.
One of the bottom lines here, though, and why I'm presenting this information, is oftentimes to lay people, just like when I talked about human behavioral ecology, sociobiology, cultural evolution, evolutionary psychology, and here, people often have the idea that this is just grouped under some omnibus biological explanation of behavior, and contrast it with a cultural or a social explanation. But all these fields are getting at slightly different questions. And in fact, behavioral geneticists typically have almost no evolutionary perspective whatsoever. They're purely interested in looking at variation and seeing how much is caused by genes versus environment. Okay. So we talked briefly about behavioral genetics and genetics in general. Now let's talk a little bit more about development and environment in evolutionary psychology. So some of Tooby and Cosmeny's nice examples talked about how oftentimes when people see differences between individuals or that traits change across the lifespan, there's an assumption that there's no benefit of thinking about things from an evolutionary perspective. They use some examples of how this is a misguided way of approaching behavior and morphology. So, if something is not present at birth, does that mean that it's learned or that it's cultural or social, just as a general explanatory process? No. So obviously there are a lot of morphological traits that we can look at right here, such as beards and teeth and calluses. David Buss especially likes this example of calluses. He used it in the 1995 psychological inquiry paper that I put online as optional reading. What he suggests, and this is kind of a metaphor for evolutionary psychology, is that calluses can't be explained simply by an environmental explanation. That if you rub something on skin, then you create calluses. It necessarily requires an environmental input, but it also requires our skin cells to be formed in such a way that when an environmental input is present, then calluses are produced. Language works in a similar way. We have evolved to be able to acquire language, but only if there are environmental inputs present, listening to people speak. The thrust of the argument is that evolutionary perspectives try to emphasize what the required environmental inputs are to output specific types of behaviors, and how our psychology is structured to take certain aspects of the environment and then output them into certain behaviors. Okay. As an example, we talked about baldness 2 weeks ago. An evolutionary psychologist, when thinking about baldness, would not really favor a nature versus a nurture perspective in this or any other trait. So what part of baldness is genetic and what part of baldness is environmental? And let's not think about this in terms of heritability, but if I told you that there's a trait baldness, or if I told you language, or something like that, if I said what part of this is genetic and what part is environmental, which is more important for baldness, environment or genetics?
Genetics.
I think that that's a fair comment because this is going to be largely heritable. It's not, this is a mistake of mine with setting up this slide like this. And I'm going to go to the next slide real quick to comment on that. Let's skip the baldness example. And let me ask you, what part of hunger is nature versus nurture, or environmental versus genetic? The experience of hunger. Which part is it biological or is it environmental? It's a really difficult question to answer. And yeah, it's both. You can't have one without the other. What parts of language acquisition are nature versus nurture? You can't answer that question without having an evolved psychology that learns language. So dogs can't learn language. Even if you expose them to the same environmental cues, we would not have the capacity to learn language. If you take a baby and you never expose them to any language whatsoever, they're not going to learn a language if you take the environment away. The thrust of evolutionary psychology is understanding how our evolved psychology interacts with the environment. So Tooby and Cosmines have said that every aspect of an organism's phenotype is the joint product of its genes and its environment. To ask which is more important, genes or environment, is like asking what's more important in determining the area of a rectangle. The length of the rectangle or the width of the rectangle. You can't have area without both the length and the width, and it's nonsensical to talk about things in terms of which is more important. Which is more important in causing a car to run? The engine of the car or the gasoline? Which is more important in a man being aggressive around other men? The genes or the environment? The fact that he's around other men and he's been insulted, the environmental prospect or aspect, or the fact that human brains are designed to take inputs from members of the social environment, but not necessarily chairs. Okay, I have a series of examples now. I'm going to go through a few of them, and then we'll take one more break before I get back to some of my research that I'll tell you about. So, I've talked to you about this idea of modularity, and these ideas of these different types of adaptive problems that might be dealt with different types of psychological programs. Let's talk about one related to incest avoidance. So this is closely related to Hamilton's rule with R, B, and C, that relatedness coefficient. This is a big problem. How do organisms estimate what that relatedness coefficient is? This relates to another problem other than incest aversion, and it's, I'm sorry, other than investing in kin, and it's knowing whom to not have sex with. So let's think about the human EEA. This is a prototypical step for evolutionary psychology researchers. So humans have lived in environments in which opposite-sex individuals varied in the probability of yielding low viability offspring. It's a little bit of a complex sentence. Basically, in the environments in which people lived, some opposite-sex individuals might yield offspring that